Well, I'm going to have to put my hand up and say I made an error. I'm not sure if I pressed the wrong button or something went wrong with the software, but I'm afraid the video recording of the session that we ran about an hour and a half ago did not come out. It recorded for 3 minutes only, so I apologize for that. So this is going to be a re-recording without the interaction with all the participants. But I promised a video recording, and that's what we're going to get. So just to let you know that this is basically a session that we ran about an hour and a half ago on Tuesday, the 5th of May, and the subject, as you can see, is all about how to deploy a 360-degree feedback implementation. So normally I would talk about this being an interactive session and that we'll take questions at any point, but it isn't. It's a one-way recording. I would imagine I'll be finished well within 30 minutes, but we'll see. Okay, well, I'm going to kick off with just a picture of where we're going with this session. This is me. I'm the head of TLC Online. We are the makers of Click 360, so that's our brand of 360-degree feedback. And this is the fourth of 9 group mentoring sessions designed to share best practice when it comes to 360-degree feedback implementations. Okay, so let me go through the topics that I want to cover on this session. First of all, let's just give you a second or two to read what's on this slide, then I'll go through each of these in a bit more depth. So let's kick off with purpose. We'll go there first. Now it's interesting because what I've put into this slide is really a question, and I opened this up to the audience earlier on today when we were live, and I got feedback from audience members about whether they believe the purpose of a 360 is assessment or development. And what I discovered is I probably hadn't set the question up in the right way, because really what I mean by this is, are you using this to assess someone or to develop someone? Of course, 360-degree feedback is an assessment tool. The whole process is based on a questionnaire that both the participant and a whole group of raters, the people that provide feedback to the participant, they all get involved in this. So it is an assessment in that sense. But really what I meant by the question is, does the purpose of 360 serve the performance management process or performance appraisal process, or should it be reserved for development? I think once I explained that and clarified what I meant by the question, we pretty much reached agreement on the answer, because what we discovered is that if raters know that the 360 results they could impact the participants' remuneration or their career progression, two things can happen. One is that the raters come to an agreement with each other to scratch each other's backs. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Especially as in a lot of these cohorts, the rater is also going to be a participant. So they come to almost an agreement amongst themselves to just say good, uplifting things and score highly, so that there's no issue when that person's rating them. So it's a two-way agreement, and that's not good. Or, another thing that can happen is that the rater that you don't get on with sees this as their moment to sort of bring you down, with ultra low scores and negative comments. So either way, if the organization uses this as an assessment tool as part of the performance management process, the scores and the comments might not be reliable and trustworthy. And also, if the whole 360 population is going through the process at the same time, or during a narrow window of time that's related to a milestone in the performance management timetable, like appraisals, the process will cause possibly hundreds of questionnaires to be flying around the business at the same time. And this is just going to be highly disruptive to business as usual at best. At worst, it could even bring the organization to its knees. So for that reason, it is much better to divorce the process from the assessment cycle and focus the purpose purely on development. That way you can split the 360 population into smaller cohorts, maybe 10 or 12 participants at a time, and you spread the implementation throughout the year, which has a lot of logistical benefits. And another benefit of doing it this way is it sends a clear message to participants and to raters that the 360 process is in no way related to the performance management system, and that will encourage more reliable results. Now, the next question I asked was all about indications for 360. In other words, where should you use it? Okay, well, sorry, let's go back. The slide in front of you shows that the most popular use of 360-degree feedback is this one, which is it's tied in with some kind of leadership or management development program, and the questionnaire used will relate to competencies or behaviors associated with leadership or management capability, and that includes emotional intelligence these days, perhaps even more important as we start to resume business as usual activities after lockdown. So LDP or MDP is probably the biggest area of indication for 360. I think about 60% of our programs are related to those. But we've also been asked to support some smaller organizations by just extending the scope of the 360 to cover nearly all staff. For example, to include individual contributors where there are no direct reports. But that does take away a very important rater category, the direct report category, which in some ways dilutes the power of 360. Much more common, in addition to an LDP or an MDP, is making the 360 application available on demand, to managers or leaders throughout the year. Although we would still add the cautionary caveat about keeping it separate from the performance appraisal process. But there is one big contraindication, this one here, to the use of 360, and that's when an organization thinks it might help to fix someone who is underperforming. Now, we've been doing this for a long, long time, since the beginning of the millennium. And we know that A, it will never work, and B, it's a complete waste of everybody's time. What needs to happen in that situation is that the manager of that individual needs to man up and face into the conflict and to start to have one or even more difficult conversations with them. Okay. It's always a bit of a red flag when an organization approaches us and asks if they could use a 360 on with one person. We always like to do a bit of digging to find out what's the purpose, what are the indications here. Okay, so this next topic that I want to cover is all about cultural readiness. And it's interesting because on the call we had at least one participant who is about to introduce this into an organization where the culture is different in different parts of the organization. It's not one culture it's actually a local authority, and that results in a whole group of different cultures depending on which part of the organization you're looking at. So the way that we recommend that we look at cultural readiness is that we look for things that support a 360. So, for example, a senior team that will participate first. If that happens, it sends out a really strong message to the whole organization that this is something that is of strategic importance. And, it's very often driven by a highly proactive and progressive chief exec or managing director who is a little bit more evolved perhaps than some of the others in the organization, and really drives this. And similarly, another good indication is the second one here, which is that a senior manager, very positive about this process, will kick it off with a message. And if the briefings are being done face to face, then those messages could be delivered each time. But probably a better solution would be a video recording of the senior manager making an impassioned plea to everybody in the business about why we're doing this, what we hope to get out of it, and so on and so forth. So just a short positive message from a senior manager, someone who's respected within the organization, will often set the right culture. Something else to think about is high priority given to the 360. In other words, time to complete it, time to develop afterwards. Remember, the 360 is really only the beginning of the journey. There should be development activities taking place afterwards. So giving time to that, giving line manager support. So for example, we'll talk in a few minutes about a process we know as checking out. Now, these are face-to-face, one-to-one discussions. They can be done on the phone, but the idea is that they are verbal conversations. And what we don't want is the line manager continually postponing the checking out discussion. That is a really poor signal. The budget, the budget should include development activities, because that is going to be a likely outcome of the whole process. So there needs to be some thought given to how much we can afford to spend on maybe books or videos or e-learning packages or training, face-to-face classroom training, or coaching, or video conferences or whatever. But there needs to be some thought given, and therefore a budget put aside for more than just the 360. All of those things are indicators that that 360 is going to work. Where it's going to be difficult, where the culture won't support it, is going to be demonstrated by things like autocratic leadership style, where there's a command and control approach, or the opposite end of that spectrum, where you've got like a very laissez-faire leadership style. Everything's pretty much optional. Neither of those are good indicators for a successful 360. You've also got issues where feedback's not welcomed. It's not that kind of organization. You don't do that here because it results in defensive actions or justifications. Worse still, there might even be potential backlash when you start telling your truth, such that participants, they just keep their head down and keep below the parapet. They just do what the guy in front did. That's the safest way. So if you're meeting any of those kinds of situations, and obviously the opposite of all the things on that list, then if the senior team won't support it, if a senior manager won't kick it off, etc., those are all signs that your organization may not be ready. And it's a step that we undertake at the beginning of any request for our support. Okay, so we've covered a fair amount of ground in terms of deploying a 360, but the next one is all about where to start. And what we have in this picture, let me just move I think you're seeing me in the corner. I'm going to move myself over, just so you can see this is a typical 9-box talent management model. Um, and I asked the question when we were doing this live a little while ago. I did ask the question, out of this, 9 boxes, out of these 9 boxes, where in any organization are you most likely wanting to start? Let me start, sorry, by asking what groups of workers, which groups of workers are most likely to want to develop. So the answer comes up in the next slide, which is that what we're talking about here are different groups where the people are hungry for development and they're more likely to welcome the 360 opportunity. You'll see that they're often, these are different names given to the same groups, but the idea is that they're in either the green area or they're in the sort of middle area here. And it's important that we think about that when we kick off a 360, because what you really want, you want some champions, if you like, internally, praising the process and saying, how beneficial it was to start to embed a culture of readiness for 360. The graduate population, surprisingly, we did a very successful project a couple of years back with graduates in an organization. And although it's more difficult because they're never in one place for long, it is possible. You can find people that have got enough data, if you like, they've observed them for long enough to be able to contribute feedback. That was a really useful group to take through 360. We're talking about where to start, remember, so you can extend it once you've got some good press. Other valid answers to the question is, would include the senior leadership team, but only where the chief exec is driving it, which relates obviously to the previous slide. And I think that is where you should look to kick off your 360 if you can. Just bear in mind, if this is part of a leadership development program, you may not have people in those groups on that leadership development program. You may have if it's a future leader program, but if it's an existing management development program, for example, you may have a mix of people. In other words, a mix of people from these different boxes. Maybe what you do is you organize for at least the first cohort to be people that are in this part of the organization, so that they'll give the 360 a good thumbs up. They'll like it. Okay, so we moved from that to talk about what we call a supplier checklist. Now, this is what we mean here is, let me move this back again. So we're talking here about how to choose your supplier. You need to ask yourselves if you purely want an application to run your surveys on, in which case you have a lot of choice, or whether in addition to that, you want expert advice around the whole implementation. For example, a bespoke questionnaire, help with briefings, feedback coaching, etc. And that will determine what kind of background expertise you need. So we've split this topic into 2 items around background expertise, 5 items around the 360 tool and the supporting infrastructure, and then finally one about value for money. So kicking off with the provider's background, they generally either come from an HR or L&D background, or they come from an IT background. So on the one hand, you've got sort of HR practitioners who've moved into this space, 360 feedback tools, or you've got pure sort of software houses. And if the provider's platform was initially built for in-house practitioners, in other words, they used the product on their own clients in the first place, and these practitioners were leadership development specialists, then it's likely that that platform will prove more user-friendly and more comprehensive. That's the case with my own company. if you're looking for a bespoke platform, something that is this is, we're talking about software capability now. If you're looking for something bespoke, then you may want a provider who can build you an application that's specific to your needs. And we've done that for Diageo, for Lego, for Tata over the years, and many, many others as well. And you need to understand if they've got that capability, if they have a track record of that. And you also need to understand how long that process is going to take and when they can start. Okay. In terms of security and support, which is the next one down, cybersecurity is an ever-growing threat. You just need reassurance that their platform is robust and secure, and that they are GDPR compliant when it comes to data. It's useful to know, for example, if they have the Cyber Essentials accreditation. Another question here is all about survey setup and management. In other words, do you have the resources to set up and manage projects yourself? Or do you need that all done for you? Because that's going to determine who you select. You also need to think in terms of the questionnaire interface. Now, we use sliding scales in our questionnaire interface. Let me show you what I mean. So this is a sliding scale. The scale goes from 0 to 100. It's a 100-point scale. But as you can see, it's graded according to a Leica scale underneath. But that's a sliding scale. Do you want that, or do you want radio buttons or checkboxes or even drop-down lists? That's something to look at. Look at the scoring mechanism. Most of the time you can see all of this on their website, or perhaps you can have a demo. If individual raters are likely to be asked to complete more than one questionnaire, and that typically happens the higher up you go in an organization, then you should look for a simultaneous rating feature as shown here. So what you're seeing here is that all of the people that, in my case, I've been asked to rate, okay, they're all on the one page. And that combined with the sliding scale saves raters a significant amount of time while improving accuracy, because you can think in relative terms between these people, not just absolute terms about each one. So there's a big advantage if that's likely to happen. Okay, let me just go back to the previous slide. What I want to talk about here is reporting. Now, it's interesting because next week's group mentoring session is actually focused on individual and organizational reporting. So for now, I would simply recommend that you take a thorough look at the quality and the layout of the individual report and how easy it is to interpret. Ask if there's an associated workbook, because that usually provides a guide on how best to interpret the report, how best to work with it, and always look for space to capture reflections as you're learning about yourself through the report. Now, if you're putting several cohorts through the program, it's going to be important to know if there's any capability to report on organization-wide capability. In other words, is there the ability to cut the data organizationally, and whether you could sort that in different ways. So do tune in to next week's program. Sign up for it if you haven't already, on reporting. Okay. When it comes to value for money, you need to run a thorough check on the costings, obviously. But you've got to be careful, because you need to make sure there are no hidden extras. I can tell you from experience that it isn't easy to make comparisons between different providers, simply because of the very different ways that each present their costings. So I think best to make comparisons on a single metric, which is the overall cost per participant with everything included. Boil it down to that. And if that changes depending on the volume, then obviously predict the volumes you might need and get the price per participant for the different volumes. That's the best way to make comparisons. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to flag up to you is the fact that we've written a blog on the whole subject of deploying the 360 survey, and it actually goes into that last slide in a lot of depth, and it effectively gives you a checklist that will help you to choose the right supplier. There's a link to it actually in the slide. You can just click there and you'll get the link. Okay, that's on the Self-Drive website. So we have one more slide to go, and I'm going to show it to you now. It's all about what we believe is a model implementation plan for 360. It's quite a busy picture, this, so let me walk you through it. It goes from left to right and then down along here. Okay, so this is the first step. This is a detailed scoping discussion. It's really covering all the things we've talked about earlier. So, for example, purpose, cultural readiness, where to start, etc. And then you make a decision about how you're going to deploy the 360, where you're going to start, and all the rest of it. And that takes you to a decision point about whether to build a bespoke questionnaire or to go with the provider's own questionnaire. Then there's an awareness briefing. It's a really important step. Now, remember, you can watch the video, which is linked, if you weren't on the last call, the last group mentoring session, you can watch the video, which is linked to on the booking page for future sessions. You'll see that you can access the video for that session that we ran on awareness briefing. Really important session. It was run by my colleague, Belinda Kiley. So do look at that if you want more detail on an awareness briefing. Now then you're looking here at running the survey. So basically you set it up and run it, and then you generate the reports at the end. Sounds really easy, but if you do the things that we said in the awareness briefing, you'll get a pretty good completion rate and a lot of quality in that data. So you get the reports, and then you move down to the coaching. Now, our coaching follows the best practice model of 2 sessions. So this first session is focused on helping the participant to understand their report and also to manage their reactions. And the second, which is here, is really focused on development action planning. So what needs to be different going forward. But in between, you'll see these 2 steps. Well, I say in between, you'll see this one step and there's another one after. These steps are really important in our experience. This one we call checking out, and the second one is checking in. Checking out is more about getting clarity and depth on what was discovered here. And you do this through verbal conversations. They may not need to be face-to-face, especially right now, but they need to be a conversation. Now, we're going to talk about checking out in a future group mentoring session. So make sure you book onto that if you haven't already. And then checking in, which is down here, is really a simple, and it takes place, by the way, some months later. We're not talking immediately. The gap between these 2 sessions is probably only 6 to 8 weeks, whereas this takes place maybe several months after the second coaching session. Because in this coaching session, you've agreed what it is you're going to be doing differently, and you've got a plan for that, an action plan. This is all about, whoops, jump back to the same slide. This is more about, how am I doing? This is what I said I was going to do. How am I actually doing? So again, checking in is the very last of our group mentoring sessions. It's the 9th one. And you can click on the link in the next slide to book on that if you haven't already. So that was a pretty whistle-stop tour. I'm just checking my clock. I think we're almost at the end anyway, but I wanted to be sure that we covered all of that in the absence of the interactive session that I ran earlier. So I've got all the points across. So next Thursday, the 14th of May, we drill down into what you want from a good individual report and what organizational data can be valuable to the business as a whole. And to book those future sessions, please click on the link shown in this slide. It's just here. Remember, you're going to get a copy of the slides as a follow-up if you either booked and attended or booked and couldn't attend. And thanks to all of those who did attend earlier, as well as the slide deck, I'll make sure you get a link to this recording very soon. That's it from me. Please follow the rules, stay safe, stay well. Bye for now.